Okay, today we are looking at the crossing, exploring the role of religion in our spiritual quest. One thing I wrote at one time is, think of religion as any of the many paths that lead to the river's bank. The spiritual quest begins the moment you understand that the way to the other side is a solo journey. And I like that idea that the place for religion, and that is for those of us that have stepped upon a more spiritual, maybe less formal way, that every experience that we have from a religious perspective has given us something to think about, has given us a direction to go. I know when I was raised in the more traditional approach, that meant a lot to me. It didn't mean a lot to me in the early years, but it started meaning something to me. I started asking questions about it. It's a place to begin. And of course, the exposure that you get, it connects you with thoughts of God, thoughts of Jesus, thoughts of, the role all these two play in our life. The notion of sin, the notion of the need for salvation, all of these things are put on our table, and we are then able to think about them. What do they mean? It gives us a standard on how to approach life and whether or not we will adopt that standard. Some people will never question it. It will go through their whole life without questioning it. Will accept it as it was given to them by an authority, and they're going to keep it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think as long as we are comfortable at the river bank, then we can stay there as long as we want. But we start asking ourselves, the whole spiritual awakening is what's on the other side of this river? What's that reality? Is it something I can experience? Is it something available to me? And my religion may be saying, well, it's not available to you at this moment, but when you leave your body, you'll be able to cross the river. But we begin to question that because we're told, even in the traditional way of thinking, that God is omnipresent, everywhere present equally at the same time. So would that not mean that God is present here as well as there? So maybe I can begin to go across that river. And what we find is there are no boats on the bank, that we have to get across in our own way. We have to ask our own questions. We have to see how, attached we are to the particular riverbank we're on right now. And some of us, I think, have found ourselves swimming out a little ways and turning around, coming back, still holding on to some of the traditional ways of thought. But the important thing is that we start questioning, because every religion is a set of preconceived ideas that have been worked out for us. And they're laid on the table, and we're told basically, here it is. Here's what you are to believe if you are in this particular faith. And when we start asking questions, and I have had so many experiences with people that started out that way, they accepted that, but they had experienced some tragedy in their life where there were no answers to the problem they were having. They could not find answers within the context of their religion. And so in a way, they were there at the riverbank, and they had an experience that was not being addressed by what they had learned through their religion. So they started asking more questions. They started questioning the authority of the religion. They started questioning the nature of God. Something as simple as, how could we say God is love one moment and then be able to entertain the idea that we might end up outside the kingdom for eternity, wailing and gnashing our teeth? We're given kind of a dual perspective of the whole thing. So what we're given is, in terms of religion, and this is true, I think, across the board, all world religions, is a preconceived set of ideas. Problems are laid on the table, and here's how religion will answer them. And quite often I would hear that we just have to accept something in faith sometimes, that maybe there's not a cut and dried answer, that we just accept it in faith. And that is, accept it in faith with the understanding of a certain image of God, that God has his reason for withholding answers from me. But I think it's extremely important for all of us to question. And I'm not alone in this. Though America was founded on Judeo-Christian values, one of its founding fathers and primary author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, undertook a remarkable project. Armed with a razor and paste, he cut from the Bible only those passages attributed to Jesus that he considered authentic. He then pasted them in a book that today is known as the Jefferson Bible. And I have a copy of this at home. I had forgotten that I have it, and I saw it and opened it up, and it sparked a whole new way of thinking, because not a whole new way of thinking, but sent my thinking down a whole different road. Because this is basically what I have been doing as well, as cutting and pasting, only I use the modern term, computer, of cut and paste from the Bible those sayings that I feel are appropriate and that probably originated with Jesus. But in a letter to John Adams, dated October 12th, 1813, he writes, "In extracting the pure principles which he, Jesus, taught, we should have to strip off the artificial vestments in which they have been muffled by priests, who have travestied them into various forms as instruments of riches and power to them. There will be found remaining the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man." So Jefferson had the courage to look at the Bible and say, maybe it's not all what we think it is. Maybe there's something more to it. The difference between his approach and what I would take is he took a moral approach. He was kind of a Puritan type. And he basically said that he believed Jesus offered the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. But he's saying you have to cut out things. And there's actually photocopies of this Bible that he made, and he did this for himself. It was a personal endeavor. But just back in that day for him to do this, and he tried to get some famous minister of the day to work with him. That minister was not as interested in dissecting the Bible, because Jefferson was not interested in stories of things like the resurrection. He was not interested in the virgin birth, was not interested in miracle stories, any of that stuff. He cut all that out and just kept the moral teachings. So in that day, that would have taken a lot of courage. Would take a lot of courage today. The Jesus Seminar, which has basically done that, also trying to uncover the historical Jesus from the Gospels, they have received a lot of criticism from the mainstream Christian community. Anyone who questions that, as our neighbors down the street say, we believe every word of the Word, and that's typical. But there are those of us that want to question. We have questions about how this whole thing came about. And who was this man Jesus? Jefferson saw him as a moralist. I see him as a mystic. And the reason I think the mystic is more important than the moralist is because if we understand and tap into the spiritual values, the mystical side, if we understand our oneness with God, the moral side follows. We naturally want to be a better person. We naturally want to help others. We naturally want to, be a higher moral, the way we project in the world. And it's not that we try to do that. When we try to live a good moral life, we do a lot like Paul does and say, why do I do the things I hate? Why can't I do the things I always agree with? And who hasn't asked themselves that question? But the whole mystical presentation, the whole idea of becoming conscious of our oneness with God produces a very high moral character. So morality is an effect of the cause of spiritually waking up. I think it was Emma Curtis Hopkins pointed out on the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not do this or that. She says you think of that not as a command, but as prophecy. When you awaken to your inner spirit, you shall not do these things. Naturally, it's a natural effect of waking up to what you are at the deeper level. So that is where I would say, Jefferson, I think, was on the right track in questioning how the Bible was put together. And he attributes it to priests, but the modern scholar just calls them evangelists. They were evangelists in the sense that their job was not to present the teachings of Jesus, but to present the teachings of the early church. And as long as we understand that, we'll be able to read the Gospels more intelligently. That their job was, they did not see their job as presenting, here's what the greatest spiritual teacher in the world taught. Their job was to present, here's what the church teaches, and here's how the church wants you to think of Jesus. And that's exactly how they came about. And Mark was the first, as I keep saying. Matthew and Luke agreed with that and included most of Mark in their Gospels, and then John comes along with a fairly different presentation, but it's also the picture of Jesus as the only begotten Son of God. That comes through loud and clear. But John represents more of a blending of the mainstream Christian thought with the mystic. It's more of a mystical presentation. It's called, and I think from the 2nd century, people started referring to it as the spiritual gospel, and because it's of a spiritual nature. And but the others are not interested in presenting the teachings of Jesus. When they do present the teachings of Jesus, they will modify them to reflect the teachings of the church. That's what we always have to keep in mind. And again, that's what I'm working on in my book, and how to identify that, how to read the Gospels and be able to detect when it is the evangelist speaking or when it is the mystic speaking. Because the mystic is, that's a lesson, a voice that we do not want to miss. And it's so easy to let that get buried in what the church taught. This is not in any way, in my thinking, sacrilegious, because I do not consider the Bible the Word of God. I consider the Word of God that living presence that is within all of us, that actually brought us to a place like this, brought us to a teaching like this. It's a living activity that keeps pushing, stands at the door of our consciousness and knocks. But the mainstream Christian sees the Bible as God someplace off in the distance dictating this book to us through special prophets and special writers. It's the belief that God is separate from us. But the Word of God, as I understand it, means I am one with God. And I can hear that word, and I have heard that word, and I have responded to it, which has caused me to leave the riverbank and start swimming across the river. That's the Word of God in my thinking. That I see I see the Bible as the word of man, the work of people. And it does not agree with itself all the time, and I understand why. I'm understanding better all the time. Never was intended to be put together as it is and presented as the Word of God. But that's not to criticize the Bible, it's to understand it. And you can read any commentary, go ask any question about the Bible, go online, read any commentary. What you will get from the mainstream perspective is that Bible is the anchor. It's the Word of God. And we don't always understand what God is trying to tell us. That's why we have a professional clergy. But for a person like Jefferson who knows all of that, to say, I think there's something more here. I think we can look at this in a new way. He was a person who had the courage to be able to do that. And he was highly criticized for it. He was, at one point, was trying to sell his library to Congress. And he was criticized for some of the books he had, because they were kind of off the wall. I guess, I don't know what they were, but I read excerpts from one person that's in Congress that did not think that they ought to waste their money on Jefferson's library. Who wouldn't love to have that today? While Jefferson remained true to his religious values, he did not stop there. In his own way, he took up the spiritual quest and began swimming. He found in the Gospels a deeper message that was being offered in the mainstream religion of his day. And that's one of the things I question myself, because I was born a Christian. And so how far do you go? How far do you color outside the lines before you're not considered a Christian? To the literalist, you don't go outside the lines. There's no room. But that's a question I have asked myself. Most of my family considers themselves Christian. Am I a Christian or not? I would consider myself a follower of the way. That's what the early followers of Jesus were called, followers of the way. The way was the body of teachings that he taught. And the way died with him. And the reason it died with him is because he was not a writer. He didn't put in writing the way, the principles of the way. Don't we wish he had? But his teachings were passed on by word of mouth, and they were passed on by people who probably did not understand the mystical principles, the principles of oneness with God. As I said last week, the Jews were going to stone Jesus for declaring he and the Father were one. That was blasphemous. But that's what the mystic would declare. And not just the Father and I are one, but all of us are expressions of God. And so they would have stoned him for that. They would have had the right to do that, to stone him based on this claim that humankind is one with God, and you in particular think you're one with God. So that was quite an offense. But what he taught was interpreted by the people that followed him. and they would probably discuss things he taught and, back and forth. Try to figure out how they fit in with life. But I think as a teacher, that's what his whole mission was. You are one with God. If you wake up to this truth, it will help you in your life. It will help you live a better, more prosperous, peaceful, God-centered life. It's not about practicing things that are, all the 600 some things you've got to practice every day. That's not going to get you into heaven. That's the precepts of man. You want to come to the living force within yourself, wake up to that, and it will help you see life in a different way. You'll become more aware of the spiritual dimension. And most important, you'll become aware of that presence of God within yourself. And that's a very different message, because the church, the synagogue, whatever, has always put something between humankind and itself. It has actually inserted itself between God and man. But the mystic removes the middleman, removes that barrier. I think Jesus started out talking to the common person. They responded to him quite well. He was addressing the individual and the spiritual awakening of the individual. But the religious institution is more concerned with keeping itself going. It's not as interested in the individual as it is in manipulating the individual. So they will support the institution. It becomes more about the machine than it does the man, the individual. And this has always been true with religion. It's true in unity. It's why I got out of it, why I got out of the mainstream flow of it, because it stopped doing that. It focused more on the organization than it did on what the organization was teaching, what it was designed and born to teach. All religions represent a set of preconceived beliefs that have been worked out by other minds. We stand on the bank of the river and wonder what lay on the other side. We know what the professionals have told us. Some of it makes sense, and some of it we question. The spiritual path is ultimately a solo journey. Like Jefferson, we should reach a point where we are no longer satisfied with those who are merely teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. And I think everyone here is familiar with this idea. I'm kind of preaching to the choir today. But it's important to remind ourselves, and again, the question, am I Christian? You probably all ask that question. How important is that title? There are a lot of people in this world that do not profess themselves, profess their religion as Christian. And one of the problems we have as Christians is the mainstream Christian says, if you're not one of us, you're not going to make it. And I didn't know if they still believe that, but I went online and did a search on that, and they certainly do. If you're not in this club, you're not going to make it into that gated community that we call heaven. Do I have to fit into that way of thought in order to say I think Jesus was one of the most profound teachers on this planet? Do I have to embrace Christian dogma to embrace Jesus? That's the struggle I've had, and I think I'm winning the battle. I don't think I have to do that. Well, what I think is it doesn't matter. What is your spiritual path? Do you call it Christian, or do you just call it your spiritual path, your journey? I'm very grateful for what I have picked up, but I also found that I have to unload a lot of it. Maybe I'm a recovering Christian. And I know how absurd this will sound to a lot of people. But what is the title? The followers of Jesus were called the followers of the way. They weren't called Christians till sometime later. Did that make them any less? And the reason they were called Christians is because they were proclaiming Jesus was the Christ, the anointed, the only begotten Son of God. So we ask the question, is that what Jesus taught? And the answer to that question is, we don't know, but I don't think so. We know the church taught it. That's the whole basis of the gospel message. Jesus is the Christ. Mark starts out something like, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. First line. That is a signal. Here's how you are to think of Jesus, according to the church. And that's the whole purpose of Mark. Everything that follows puts the thinking in line with that. So we have the teachings of Mark, or whoever wrote Mark. And we have an author who has taken sayings attributed to Jesus and put them in that context. What would Jesus say? How would he approach it? And that's why it's important, as I read the Gospels, as I do this very therapeutic writing project, I'm always asking, is this something a mystic would say? And I'm basing that question on, a mystic would recognize God centered in every person. Every person is divine. Every person is an expression of that, though on the ego level, on the personality level, sometimes we get pretty messed up. But that doesn't change what we are at the deepest level. And the mystic would also say that the individual and God are one. There's no place where God leaves off and the individual begins. So with that framework, is this something a mystic would say? And what I'm finding is some of it is, some of it isn't. But I believe all of the things that came from the mouth of Jesus were something a mystic would say. It's just our work to separate that out. And it's not that difficult to do. Okay, so the religious thing, it's something all of us understand. We are all exposed to some level of it, some type of it. And we're all faced with the questions I've raised today, I think, is, do I still fit in that? Am I a Christian? What is that? What is a Christian? And can I make the distinction between Christian dogma and the teachings of Jesus? Because I think that's really what it comes down to. And I fully embrace the teachings of Jesus. What I see there, I don't see how you can unsee it once you see it. But I do see how you can let go of some of the baggage that goes along with it. Okay? Thanks for coming out. Thank you for watching this week's program. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with others. We want to reach as many people as we can, and we appreciate your help. If you'd like to help support this ministry, just click the donate card at the top right-hand corner of your screen. Your financial support means a lot to us. We have many subjects in our video lineup, so feel free to take a look. If there's a topic you don't see and would like me to address, just put it in the comment section. I'd love to know what's on your mind. To subscribe to this channel, simply click our logo. Thanks again for your interest in independent unity, and have a wonderful week.